Hey, hello. I'm motivated to do the second sharing of the day. From time to time, I do this, and today was one of those days. I was reading a book written by a Columbia professor, University of Columbia, and he writes a book about his understanding of Buddhism. So I'm always open to read somebody else, and just as he sets himself up, his background was in one of the early Western Tibetan Buddhism monks. He says that he was the first. And okay, professor, I'll take you at your word. But be careful what you proclaim. Who's to say it was first and last? And it matters not. But I had a hard time with this book. More problems. Some things we were in total agreement, but some problems too. And I've titled this episode Zeal. Leave Zeal for the Zealots. And I'll go into some explanation. But I basically wanted to address two things. The Zeal and Zealots. And I want to talk about suffering and the general understanding of suffering and the view that I have come to accept. So let's start with zeal. The overexcitement when someone had made a discovery. And this professor doesn't claim enlightenment, but he does claim enthusiasm. And he mentions it as a 35-year relationship with the Dalai Lama. And where I became aware that I needed to pay particular attention if I was to continue reading his book was off-the-cuff statement that Buddhism, as shared by Shakyamuni, was further refined in the Tibetan Buddhism tradition. And I'm very familiar with Tibetan Buddhism and find many aspects fascinating. But what stands out most in my mind is the four major schools, the schisms, the personal and sometimes petty disagreement with others, offering more division. And this is not a criticism, not a scholarly criticism of Tibetan Buddhism, because within every tradition this same divisions, separations has occurred. It's just a little disappointing in something that holds promise of unity, inclusiveness. But Tibetan Buddhism didn't fail. A few Tibetan Buddhists may have. But that's not important. That was just something, a signpost, something as I was reading it, said, pay attention. And I have to give kudos, I have to give respect to a fellow academician, professor, university professor, and I too devoted my career to teaching at a university. But as I mentioned to my friend in a response to a message he sent me, I'd rather share from my heart than teach from my mind. And this is something that I learned, I valued and I learned, and I tried my best to utilize in my many years of having access, being able to influence, or maybe at least entertain college students. But I always knew that what I had to share from the heart overpowered anything that came from my mind. But I do appreciate the trappings of scholastic life. I have first-hand experience with the full range of experience of this chosen livelihood. But the zeal, when I first experienced the transition from non-abiding to abiding, awakening, from progressive awakening to permanent awakening, I had a certain amount of enthusiasm. And enthusiasm, I think, is a milder word for zeal. Zeal has some other baggage. And nobody likes a zealot. So I had enthusiasm, and I wanted to share with everybody that I could, everybody that was important to me. Well, this tremendous change in my understanding. Because that's all that changes, isn't it? Is your understanding, your being, who you are, doesn't change. All that you do is awaken to who you've always been, what you've always known. So I had some enthusiasm, but I quickly tempered it because it just wasn't well received. I couldn't find too many people. I found 2 people who shared my enthusiasm. But everybody else pretty much said, sure. Right, you did what? Okay. Moving on. Yeah, so I learned to temper my enthusiasm. They show on TV, curb your enthusiasm. Yes, indeed. And with 20/20 hindsight, I know that I would have been much better served not to have shared this until I had spiritually matured enough to come from equanimity, to not see myself as something special, as I admit to doing in the first year or maybe 2 years after these events. And it was only by understanding how truly ordinary what I experienced was. Ordinary in the sense that when the time is right, everyone will experience in their own way, their own unique way, experience what I had experienced. What I am experiencing as we speak. And I wanted to read something from the good professor's book, which will remain nameless, to protect the innocence. And again, there's no criticism here. It just led me to some things that I wanted to share in my own unique way. He wrote this: in order for our lives to become completely actualized in enlightened happiness, all other beings must also experience their lives as full of happiness. We can leave no single being. We can leave out no single being. We can leave like the Three Musketeers. Sorry, Professor, I'm a little sloppy on my reading. Like the Three Musketeers, we are all for one and one for all. We cannot liberate just ourselves from suffering because it is impossible to achieve fully perfect bliss if anyone is excluded from it. Infinite interconnection logically mandates infinite responsibilities. So I have no problem with that, infinite responsibilities. Where I beg to differ is that timeliness. Words such as this idea that we have an obligation to awaken everybody else by recruiting, cajoling, coercing, insisting, proclaiming, proselytizing. You get my drift. These much too active for my. I have learned to temper everything about myself with a healthy dose of gentleness. So I prefer words like suggest, propose, proffer, point, rather than the more proactive, the more active verbs. And this idea that enlightened happiness just wasn't, that enlightenment equals happiness, because the commonality being that every one of us shares this, or most of us share this common bond of wanting to be happy. But you need to talk about the nature of happiness, because happiness is no more or less valuable than its opposite, sadness. On our journey, both of these have a place. This is the personal happiness, the personal sadness caused by events that we liked or didn't like that occurred in our lives. And mostly events outside of our control. So, if he's talking about, if he means by happiness, if he means by bliss, and I read it quite closely, he uses this word happiness, I guess interchangeable with bliss, even though he never made this explicit. And bliss is an obtainable state, but again, specifics, personal. Bliss is something that I cannot entertain other than brief, unbidden experiences of a limited time frame, a limited linear time, as I find that the state of bliss it's hard for me to remain in while remaining in this physical body. So the proselytizing, get up there and get on telling everybody, come on now, I got all the secrets, I got all the answers, come on. This kind of missionary, this is what I mean by zeal. And what starts off well-minded, positive, often goes quite quickly to becoming a zealot. So all I'm saying is, leave that zeal for the zealots. Replace it with a gentleness, an acceptance that can only come from knowing that everyone's time will come when it's their time. And although by living a mindful life, we can have a positive impact on the world, the people around us, we have to be gentle, patient, suggest, not demand, but mostly accept that people are who they are. They are where they are. Whether or not they're on the spiritual path at this time is not really our concern, my concern, to make it personal, to own it. It's not really my concern, because I understand the timelessness that it will happen when it happens. And my part in that is to do what I'm doing, share, stay in a state of equanimity, and watch and wait. Wait without expectations. Watch without judgment. Just with interest. Patience to wait. And it's not hard to wait when you understand that everything will be as it is, irregardless of how you feel about it. You do what you can do. You recognize what you can't do. You can't personally be responsible for everyone's enlightenment. After all, enlightenment is the responsibility of each and every one of us. My enlightenment is my responsibility. Your enlightenment is your responsibility. Now there's an element in Buddhism that a bodhisattva, a person who's attained a high level of understanding, will devote his life to the awakening of others. But this is not done by promotion. This is not done by pushing. This is not done by pedantic teachings. This is done by acceptance that there's no hurry. Because there's no time, at least linear time. We have the opportunity to smile and bless and love unconditionally without expectations. Why should everybody waiting? Why should we wait for everybody? Why should we expect everybody to wake up now? Simply because we have and we can't rest until our work is done. I think that's it makes me laugh and smile. And by the way, in case you're noticing, I just noticed now, I'm wearing the In-N-Out Burger t-shirt. And In-N-Out is something that is happening all the time. I'm in this, I'm out of that. In and out. Yeah, I like it. But it's kind of appropriate. Come in and I'll awaken you and go out. Quick, fast food. So there it is. That kind of helps me. That's why I'm wearing this t-shirt. Because this is kind of a fast food mentality to me, that everything has to happen quickly, instant gratification. And responsibility. Expanding my responsibility to the enlightenment of everyone. It sounds like that spiritual ego, the most insidious form of the ego, is raising its ugly head. Who am I for a moment to entertain that it's my responsibility that all beings awaken? That's zeal, dangerously close to becoming a zealot. And it's an overblown understanding of who we are. It's extraordinary expectations, setting yourself up for failure. The idea that anyone else's enlightenment or lack thereof affects me, affects my state, is naive. And I use the word enlightened naivete to describe myself. But accepted understanding of naive is this kind of idea that I'm personally responsible for everyone's enlightenment. And then we talk about suffering. Buddhism talks about how life is suffering. And inherent, and maybe this is a Western, logical, rational look at his words, inherent in the accepting that life is suffering is holding out for some state where you can escape suffering, where you're living in happy la-la land, blissed out. Yeah. My take on suffering, because it seems so obvious that life is suffering that it isn't even worth the Buddha's time or effort to point this out to us. Isn't that kind of a no-brainer? Don't we see suffering everywhere we look? My take on what he was talking about, suffering, is the suffering that every minute we're not in our natural state of wholeness and completeness, which is who and what we are. Every moment that we're not in this wholeness. Remembering what you've always known. Suffering comes from not remembering who and what you are. Our natural birthright, because there simply isn't anything else. And to have that longing, I think maybe one of the things that motivated me, and maybe motivates other people to begin the arduous path of self-inquiry, was the longing. I call it the song of the universe that I could always hear. The song that was beckoning me to wake up into my natural condition. So, I admit to some enthusiasm. I learned to curb it because it just didn't fall on open ears. Here in Taiwan, they say it a lot, fell on deaf ears. Definitely so. But mostly met by skepticism with a of the worst sort. Straight face, oh, is that so? And then, hey, yeah. And talk to, you know what, which is a condition of our temporary state. So this longing is the source of suffering. Suffering in the mundane sense, suffering in our daily lives, was utilized by me. And I'm suggesting that you might consider this, gently suggesting that it will lead you to reflection, mulling over, ruminating, as I read today, ruminating on this missing element, missing link in your life. So, for me, my personal experience, enlightenment doesn't mean endless happening. Happiness, happening. It means endless happenings, yes, but I mean, it does not include, because I see the usefulness of sadness. I see the inevitable truth that all things change. And that's why I early on adopted equanimity. And this is not elusive. This is doable, obtainable, whereas a permanent state of happiness, well, at least for me, it doesn't ring my bell. Because just as I struggled with maintaining a state of clarity until I recognized that it was not by taming, conquering, silencing, shutting down my mind, but using my mind as a process, as a tool. So I'll take equanimity over happiness. Enlightened happiness. Yeah, it has a kind of a same kind of ring to me as being in heaven with the angels. And I mentioned yesterday, playing the harp, being perpetually happy would be mighty boring. In addition to being particularly elusive. So, I would have less of a problem with this if enlightenment was life. And all the things, and living with life in a state of equanimity. Peace of mind, no matter what's occurring around you, or even to you. Acceptance, recognition. All tempered by an incredible gentleness. The gentleness that comes from timelessness. The recognition that there's a time and a place for everything and everyone.